James wiped the sweat from his forehead as he walked deeper into the old Willowbrook mine. The air was thick and dusty, making it hard to breathe. His flashlight cut through the darkness as he moved carefully along the rocky path behind him. His two best friends, Thomas and William, followed closely, their heavy boots echoing in the empty tunnels. The three men had known each other since they were small boys playing in the streets of Willowbrook. Now, at 35 years old, they worked together as mine inspectors. It was not an easy job, but someone had to check these old tunnels to make sure they were safe. Their small English village needed every job it could get. "Watch your step here," James called back to his friends. "The ground is loose." Thomas, a tall man with kind eyes, adjusted his safety helmet. "How much deeper do we need to go today?" he asked. "Just a bit more," James replied. "We need to check the far wall where the old maps show some instability." William, the quietest of the three friends, carried their electronic equipment. He had always been good with machines and technology. The device in his hands beeped softly as they walked, measuring the safety of the tunnel walls round them. The village of Willowbrook had seen better days. Many young people had moved away to find work in bigger cities. The old mine had been closed for 20 years, but the government still paid them to inspect it regularly. It was one of the few steady jobs left in their small community. As they reached the deepest part of the tunnel, William's equipment began beeping faster. "James, look at this," he said, staring at the small screen. "Something's not right here." James stopped walking and turned round. "What do you mean?" William pointed to his device. "There's a hollow space behind this wall. A big one. It shouldn't be there according to our maps." The three friends gathered around the wall William was pointing to. It looked like solid rock, covered with years of dust and small stones, but the machine was telling them something different. "Maybe there's another tunnel back there," suggested Thomas. "An old one that's not on our maps." James ran his hand along the wall. "Some of the stones felt loose. Help me clear some of these rocks." "Away," he said. "Let's see what we're dealing with." The friends worked together, carefully removing rocks and debris that had piled up against the wall over many years. It was slow, careful work. They had to make sure they didn't cause any cave-ins or damage to the tunnel structure. After an hour of work, they had cleared away enough material to see that there was indeed a space behind the wall. But it wasn't another tunnel. It was a small room, and inside that room was something none of them had expected to find. "Look at that," whispered Thomas, his voice filled with amazement. There, sitting in the middle of the small hidden space, was a wooden coffin. But this was not like any coffin they had ever seen. It was beautiful, made of dark wood that had somehow stayed perfect despite being buried for what must have been many years. "Should we open it?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. William stepped back. "We need to be careful," he said. "This could be someone's grave. We shouldn't disturb it." But James was studying the coffin more closely. Something about it seemed different. Most coffins were simple and dark, designed for mourning and sadness. This one was covered with intricate carvings of flowers, birds, and trees. The designs were beautiful and hopeful, not sad at all. "I don't think this is a grave," James said slowly. "Look at these carvings. They're not the kind of thing you'd put on a coffin for burial." The three friends stood in silence, staring at the mysterious object. The only sound was the gentle drip of water somewhere in the distance and their own breathing. James felt his heart beating faster. For months, he had been worried about the future of their village. So many people were leaving. Businesses were closing. The younger generation saw no reason to stay in Willowbrook when there were better opportunities in the cities. But looking at this beautiful, mysterious coffin, James felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. It was hope, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, this discovery could bring something good to their struggling community. "We need to get this out of here safely," James said finally, "and we need to find out what's inside." Thomas and William nodded. They all felt it too, the sense that their lives were about to change in ways they couldn't yet imagine. As they carefully lifted the mysterious coffin, James couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would be remembered as the day everything turned round for Willowbrook. The day 3 friends found something that would remind their entire village what it meant to hope again. The coffin was heavier than they expected, but not too heavy for the 3 strong men to carry together. As they made their way back through the dark tunnels toward the daylight, each man was lost in his own thoughts about what they might find when they finally opened their incredible discovery. News of the discovery spread quickly through Willowbrook. By the next morning, everyone in the village knew that James, Thomas, and William had found something mysterious in the old mine. People gathered in small groups on street corners, whispering and wondering what could be inside the beautiful wooden coffin. The village council decided to open it publicly in the town hall. They called in an expert from the nearby city, a woman named Dr. Sarah, who knew about old artifacts and historical items. She would make sure they opened the coffin safely without damaging whatever was inside. On the day of the opening, nearly every person in Willowbrook came to the town hall. The building hadn't been so full in years. Old people sat in the front rows, their faces lined with curiosity and hope. Families with children crowded in the back. Even the teenagers, who usually seemed bored with village life, were there, their eyes bright with interest. James, Thomas, and William stood near the front of the room, their hands sweaty with nervousness. They had barely slept the night before, wondering what they would find. Was it really a grave, or was it something else entirely? The coffin sat on a long table in the center of the room. In the bright lights of the town hall, it looked even more beautiful than it had in the dark mine. The carved flowers and birds seemed to dance across its surface. Margaret, the village librarian, had brought her camera to take pictures of whatever they found. Dr. Sarah wore white gloves as she examined the coffin carefully. "This is very interesting," she said, running her fingers along the carved edges. "The craftsmanship is excellent, but the style is unusual for a burial coffin. These symbols suggest celebration rather than mourning." The room was so quiet that people could hear their own heartbeats. Children sat perfectly still, sensing that something important was about to happen. Even the babies seemed to know they should be quiet. "Are you ready?" Dr. Sarah asked, looking round the room. Everyone nodded. James felt his throat tight with emotion. Whatever was in this coffin had been waiting in the darkness for decades, maybe longer now. Finally, it would see the light again. Dr. Sarah and Margaret carefully lifted the heavy wooden lid. It creaked softly as it opened, a sound that seemed to echo through the ears. Then, as the contents became visible, gasps filled the entire room. Instead of bones or a body, the coffin was filled with papers, photographs, and small objects, hundreds of them, carefully wrapped and preserved. Letters tied with faded ribbons, black and white photographs showing faces from long ago. Small toys and keepsakes that looked like they had been treasured by children. "My goodness," whispered Dr. Sarah, "this isn't a grave at all. It's a time capsule." Margaret reached in with trembling hands and picked up one of the letters. The paper was yellowed with age, but still readable. "Look at this," she said, her voice shaking with excitement. It's dated 1935. It says to the people of Willowbrook in the future. From your neighbors in the past, James felt tears starting in his eyes. 1935 had been during the Great Depression, when times were harder than anyone alive could remember. People had no jobs. Families were hungry. Many had left Willowbrook to look for work in other places. Thomas picked up her child's drawing from. The Coffin. It showed a rainbow in bright crayon colors, and underneath in a child's careful handwriting were the words, "Better days are coming." The paper was fragile, but the hope in those simple words was as strong as ever. They knew we would find this someday, William said softly. They made this for us. More people came forward to look at the contents of the coffin. There were photographs of families dressed in their best clothes, smiling despite their troubles. There were recipes written by hand, probably from meals that could feed a family when money was tight. There were small toys that children had loved, given up that future children might enjoy them. An elderly woman named Mrs. Davies was helped to the front of the room in her wheelchair. When she saw some of the photographs, she began to cry. "That's my mother," she whispered, pointing to a young woman in one of the pictures. "She was only 22 then. I remember when they made this capsule. I was just 7 years old." The room fell completely silent. Everyone turned to look at Mrs. Davies, realizing that she had actually been there when the time capsule was buried. It was during the worst year, she continued, her voice growing stronger. People were leaving every week. The mine had closed. There was no work. But the adults gathered all of us children and said we were going to make something for the future. They said that even though times were hard, they believed better days would come. James looked round the room at all the faces of his neighbors and friends. He saw hope returning to eyes that had been sad for too long. He saw children looking at the old photographs with wonder. He saw teenagers starting to understand that they were part of something bigger than themselves. They believed in the future, Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. They believed in us. Margaret carefully lifted out more items from the coffin. Each one told a story of people who had refused to give up, even when everything seemed hopeless. In their darkest hour, the people of Willowbrook had chosen to plant seeds of hope for their children and grandchildren to find. Old Elizabeth Davies sat in her wheelchair at the front of the crowded town hall, her weathered hands shaking as she held a small piece of paper. Tears rolled down her wrinkled cheeks. But she was smiling at the same time. The letter in her hands was written in the careful, uneven handwriting of a child. "I remember now," she whispered, her voice so soft that people had to lean forward to hear her. "We all wrote letters that day. The whole village came together because times were so hard. So many people were leaving, looking for work in the cities." James walked over and knelt beside her wheelchair. His voice was gentle and warm as he asked, "What did you write, Mrs. Davies? What did 7-year-old Elizabeth want to tell her future self?" Mrs. Davies looked down at the faded paper in her hands. The ink had turned brown with age, but the words were still clear. "I promised myself I would become a teacher and help children learn to read," she said, her voice growing stronger. "And I did. I taught in this village school for 45 years. I never left Willowbrook, not even when things got difficult." A murmur of recognition went through the crowd. Many of the middle-aged people in the room had been Mrs. Davies's students. They remembered her patient voice helping them sound out difficult words, her encouraging smile when they finally read their first complete sentence. "You taught my father," said a woman named Helen. "He always said you never gave up on him, even when he struggled with reading." Mrs. Davies nodded, wiping her eyes with a tissue. I remembered that little girl's promise every day I walked into that classroom, even during the hard years when we had no books, no supplies, when parents couldn't afford school clothes for their children. I kept teaching because I had made a promise to myself in this very letter, round the room. Other elderly villagers were beginning to recognize names and faces in the old photographs that Dr. Sarah and Margaret were carefully laying out on tables. The pictures showed people from the 1930s, dressed in their best clothes despite their financial troubles. Robert, a man in his 70s who ran the village post office, suddenly stood up from his chair. "That's my grandfather," he exclaimed, pointing to a photograph of a young man with kind eyes and calloused hands. "I heard stories about him my whole life, but I never saw a picture. He died before I was born." He took the photograph with trembling hands. "My grandmother always said he was the strongest man she knew, not because of his muscles, but because he never stopped believing things would get better, even when they lost their farm. Even when they had to move in with relatives, he kept saying that someday their children would have good lives again." An elderly woman who lived alone at the edge of the village gasped when Margaret handed her a piece of paper covered in faded handwriting. "This is my great-grandmother's recipe for bread pudding," she said, tears starting in her eyes. "She used to make this when there was hardly any food in the house. She could take stale bread and a few simple ingredients and make something that tasted like heaven," and held the recipe close to her heart. "I lost this recipe years ago when my house flooded. I thought it was gone forever, but here it is, waiting for me all these years." David, who owned the bakery on Main Street, was staring at a letter written by a young man. The handwriting was bold and hopeful. "This is incredible," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "This letter is from someone named David Miller. He writes about his dream of opening a bakery in Willowbrook someday, where he could make fresh bread for all his neighbors." David looked round the room at the faces watching him. "David Miller was my great-grandfather. I never knew we had the same name. My family has run the bakery for 3 generations, but I never knew it started with a dream written in a letter and buried in a time capsule." Margaret was carefully organizing all the precious items on the tables, making sure nothing was damaged or lost. "Look at all of this," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Letters, photographs, recipes, drawings, small toys. These people saved the most important parts of their lives for us to find." She picked up a small wooden toy horse, carved by hand and polished smooth by a child's fingers. "They gave up things that were precious to them so that we could understand who they were and what they believed in." James stood in the middle of the room, watching his neighbors discover connections to their past that they had never known existed. He felt something warm growing in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It was hope, pure and simple. "They never gave up on us," Margaret continued, looking round at all the faces in the room, "even when everything seemed hopeless. When people were leaving every day, when there was no work and no money, they still believed that better days would come. They believed in us." Mrs. Davies folded her letter carefully and held it against her heart. "We're the better days," she said softly. "We're the future they believed in. And now it's our turn to believe in the future for the children who will come after us." The room was filled with the sound of people crying and laughing at the same time, overwhelmed by the gift their ancestors had left them. Word of the amazing discovery in Willowbrook spread like wildfire beyond the small village. Within a week, reporters from 3 different newspapers had come to write stories about the time capsule. The headlines read: "Village finds letters from the past," and "Time capsule reveals hope from the Great Depression soon." People from neighboring towns, and even from the big cities, began arriving to see the incredible collection of letters and fit. OGIPHS. Margaret, the village librarian, had to work extra hours to organize tours of the time capsule display they had set up in the town hall. Every day, buses full of curious visitors would arrive, eager to hear the story of how 3 mine inspectors had found a coffin full of hope buried in an abandoned tunnel. Emma Clark, a 24-year-old woman who had grown up in Willowbrook, was packing her belongings to move to London when she heard about the discovery. She had already found a job in the big city and was planning to leave the following week. Like many young people in the village, she felt there was no future for her in such a small place. But when Emma saw the time capsule display and read some of the letters, everything changed. One letter in particular caught her attention. It was written by a young woman named Rose Clark, who had the same last name as Emma. As Emma read the letter, she realized that Rose was talking about her dreams of opening a small business in the village. Even though times were incredibly difficult, Rose Clark was my great-grandmother. Emma told Margaret with tears in her eyes. I never knew she had wanted to start her own business. My grandmother always said she was just a housewife who helped other people. Emma made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of moving to London, she used the money she had saved for her move to open a small tea shop right on Main Street. She decorated it with copies of some of the photographs from the time capsule and served traditional recipes that had been found in the collection. If my great-grandmother could stay and fight for this place during the worst of times, so can I, Emma told her friends. Maybe I can't change the whole world, but I can help bring life back to this village. George Patterson was another person whose life was changed by the time capsule. He had been struggling for months to keep his family farm running. The crops hadn't been good. Money was tight, and he was thinking about selling the land that had been in his family for generations. But when George read a letter written by a farmer named Henry Patterson in 1935, he discovered something that gave him new strength. Henry wrote about losing his entire crop to bad weather, about having no money to buy seeds for the next year, about watching his neighbors give up and move away. But Henry also wrote about his determination to keep trying, his belief that farming was not just a job but a way of life worth preserving. Henry Patterson was my great-grandfather. George realized, my problems aren't bigger than his work. If he could survive the Great Depression and keep this farm going, I can handle a few bad seasons. George threw himself back into his work with renewed energy. He started growing vegetables to sell to the restaurants that were opening to serve the increasing number of visitors to Willowbrook. He began offering tours of his farm, showing people how food was grown and letting children pet his animals. James watched all these changes with amazement. Streets that had been quiet and empty for years were now filled with the laughter of children playing. The sound of construction could be heard as people fixed up old buildings and opened new businesses. The village that had seemed to be dying was suddenly full of life again. Thomas opened a small museum in his house, displaying old mining equipment and telling visitors about the history of the tunnels where they had found the time capsule. William started a tour company, taking people down into the safe parts of the old mine so they could see where the discovery had been made. Families who had moved away years ago began coming back to visit. Some of them found letters or photographs of their own relatives in the time capsule. Many decided to buy back their old family homes and move back to Willowbrook permanently. The 3 friends, James, Thomas, and William, found themselves being called heroes by everyone who met them. Newspaper reporters wanted to interview them. The mayor of the nearby city invited them to speak at official events. But what made them happiest was not the fame. But seeing their community come back to life, we didn't just find a time capsule. James told Thomas and William one evening as they sat in Emma's nutty shop, "We found the soul of our village. We found proof that the people who came before us believed in us. And that gave everyone else permission to believe in themselves." Again, the village council asked James to speak at their monthly meeting about what the discovery meant for the future of Willowbrook. Standing in front of the same room where they had opened the time capsule, James looked out at faces that were now filled with hope instead of worry. "We're not the first generation to face hard times," James said, "and we won't be the last. But we can choose to believe in tomorrow, just like they did. We can choose to plant seeds of hope for the people who will come after us." 1 year had passed since James, Thomas, and William found the mysterious coffin in the old Willowbrook mine. The village had changed completely in those 12 months. What had once been a quiet, struggling community was now bustling with life and energy. Children's laughter filled the streets. New businesses lined Main Street. Families had moved back from the cities to reconnect with their roots on a warm spring morning. The people of Willowbrook gathered once again in the town hall. But this time, they were not opening something from the past. They were creating something for the future. The village council had decided to make their own time capsule to add to the original collection, so that someday, perhaps 50 or 100 years from now, their descendants would understand what had happened during this special year. James stood near the front of the room, holding his 3-month-old daughter, Lucy. She had been born just after Christmas, a tiny bundle of hope wrapped in a pink blanket. As he looked down at her sleeping face, James thought about all the changes that had happened since that day in the mine. He had gotten married to Sarah, a kind woman who had moved to Willowbrook to work as a nurse. Now they had a family, and, like so many others, they had decided that this small village was exactly where they wanted to raise their children. At a small table, James carefully wrote a letter on clean white paper. His handwriting was neat and clear as he chose his words carefully. "I want to tell them about the day we found hope buried in an old mine," he wrote. "I want them to know that even in our darkest moments, we chose to believe in better days. I want them to understand that sometimes the most important discoveries are not gold or jewels, but the knowledge that we are connected to people across time by love and hope all around the room." Other people were writing their own letters and preparing items for the new time capsule. Emma, who now ran the most popular tea shop in 3 villages, was writing about her decision to stay in Willowbrook. "I almost left this place," she wrote. "I thought there was nothing here for me. But I learned that home is not just a place on a map. It is where your family's story lives, where your roots grow deep, where you can make a difference in the lives of people you care about." George, the farmer who had found no energy after reading his great-grandfather's letter, was carefully wrapping a small bag of seeds from his best crop. "These seeds grew from soil that has fed my family for over generations," he wrote in his letter. "May they remind future farmers that the earth always provides for those who tend it with love and patience." Children sat at low tables, drawing pictures with bright crayons and markers. 10-year-old Michael drew a picture of the old mine with a rainbow coming out of it. 8-year-old Sophie drew her family standing in front of their house, with the words "We are happy here" written in purple crayon underneath. 7-year-old Peter drew a picture of all the village children playing together in the park that had been rebuilt with money from the new businesses. The teenagers, who had once talked constantly about leaving Willowbrook as soon as they finished school, were now writing about their plans to go to university and then come back to help their community grow even stronger. "I want to become a doctor and come back to take care of the people here," wrote 16-year-old Rachel. "This village gave me hope when I needed it most. Now I want to give something back. Miss is Davies, now 90 years old and still sharp as ever, sat in her wheelchair at a special table near the front. Her hands moved slowly but steadily as she wrote what she said would be her final letter to the future. Her handwriting was still clear and strong, just like her spirit. To whoever finds this someday, she wrote, "Remember that you are loved by people you've never met. You are part of a story that began long before you were born and will continue long after you're gone. The people who came before you faced troubles and challenges, just like you will, but they never gave up hope, and neither should you. Look for the helpers. Look for the people who choose kindness over fear, who choose love over hate, who choose hope over despair. Be one of those people. Never give up hope." Thomas and William were working together to organize all the letters, photographs, drawings, and small objects that people had contributed. There were recipes from the new restaurants, photographs of the restored buildings, small toys that children had outgrown, and even a piece of stone from the mine where everything had started. Dr. Sarah, the expert who had helped them open the original time capsule, had returned to help them seal the new one properly. She watched with tears in her eyes as the community came together once again, this time not to receive a gift from the past, but to give a gift to the future. As they placed the new time capsule next to the original one in a special display case, James looked round at his village. It was alive, thriving, and full of hope. The mysterious coffin had given them the greatest treasure of all, the end.